Greetings. I'm Dr. Aldrich Chan, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. My next guest is Dr. Peter Ulric Tse. He's a professor of cognitive neuroscience and the chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth College. He also directs the National Science Foundation's EPSCoR Attention Consortium. He received his BA from Dartmouth and PhD at Harvard and was awarded the Harvard William James Fellowship and the McDonald Pugh Scholarship to support a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute. In 2014, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. He's the author of The Neural Basis of Free Will, Criterial Causation, and his two-part book, A Neurophilosophy of Libertarian Free Will and Free Imagination, The Deep Roots of Creativity, Freedom, and Meaning in the Human Brain and Mind. Needless to say, he is a modern pioneer in the defense of and offense for free will. Today we begin by discussing and by defining important terms such as what is free will and libertarian free will in particular. He further clarifies the position that he defends. We subsequently move into debunk the interpretation of common studies used when arguing for determinism and the error in Sapolsky's arguments for determinism, as well as Sam Harris. Dr. Tse follows by discussing his core idea of criterial causation and free will from neurons to neural circuits. Then we move into a discussion of consciousness, intelligence, and physicalism. This transitions into the evolutionary account for free will, why it emerged, as well as the importance of imagination. We wrap up with our rapid-fire questions to more deeply understand who Dr. Tse is as a person. If any of these are of interest to you, feel free to skip around. I'd like us to begin with defining some terms just to prevent any misconceptions as we move through. And so the first question I want to ask you is, how do you define free will?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. So free will, it's very important to define our terms. In my books, I define it very precisely, but I would say if an agent has the capacity to shape the probabilities of future events in directions that it desires or intends, and then it has free will, and that the way that animals do that is by considering options, and if they're considered or imagined options coincide with possibilities that are actually true or open to them in the world, then they have a realistic imagination, and they have if they can then alter the probabilities that the desired imagined outcome is more likely to happen, actions or intentions, than the undesired possibilities, and through their own actions, whether internal mental operations or motoric operations, can affect those probabilities, then they have a free will.
Okay. And when you say libertarian free will in particular, what's the difference there?
Okay, well, there's different sorts of stances concerning free will, right? There's, I all the possibilities, but basically the essence of the libertarian position is that you are committed to the idea that events could really have turned out otherwise. So that, at a given moment, an animal really could have turned left or right, for example, for reasons that are its own. And that if you rewound the universe to the moment of, or just prior to the decision, it really could have turned out otherwise. And so the libertarian position is not compatible with determinism, because under determinism, things cannot turn out otherwise. So indeterminism is a necessary condition for the truth of the libertarian position.
Okay. So could we say then, and I know you also talk about first order and second order free will, that we could say first order free will is to have the ability to notice that there are multiple courses of action. Then I must be able to choose amongst them. I must also have the ability to have chosen otherwise, and that choice is not dictated by randomness alone, but by, in your own terms, the informational parameters uh, related to certain circuitry. And then the second order free will includes that fifth criteria, I think, that you mentioned in your book, right? And that's the ability to, or the freedom to choose the type of chooser one wants to be in the future. Would that be
Yeah,
accurate?
that's great.
Okay.
Definitely. Right. So first order free will is the ability to, weigh options in your internal virtual reality and
Mm-hmm.
evaluate them and then select among them. And, a tiger has that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a tiger doesn't really have the ability to choose to become a new kind of chooser. It's much more subject to instinct than us. No
Mm-hmm.
tiger says, "Oh, next year I want to become a vegetarian," or "Next year I want to become a different kind of tiger." That eats more pangolins and fewer, whatever, deer. Whereas we have this capacity to imagine not only among options but also future selves. Meaning, for example, it can be something as mundane as next year I want to be able to speak some foreign language that I don't speak now, for example, Swahili.
Mm-hmm.
So I can actually change my nervous system such that it can become one that can process and produce Swahili if I work hard for, a year or two.
Mm-hmm.
Or it can involve, something as mundane as deciding to go to the gym to develop a six pack or,
Mm-hmm.
bigger biceps or whatever.
Right.
But it can also involve becoming or choosing to become a new kind of chooser at a higher level. Like, for example, choosing to become someone who has a different character
Mm-hmm.
in the future than the character I have now.
And that would be a what we would call distal free will, right? Versus proximal, which is more in the short term. What
Yeah,
do I
I
do in
mean,
the near
in the scientific literature and the philosophical literature, there's been a big focus on proximal choosing,
term?
often choosing among, options that are more or less the same, right? So if I pick this apple versus that apple off the same branch, it doesn't really matter. I
Mm-hmm.
don't really care. I just want an apple, and they look kind of the same. So they're more or less equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's other kinds of proximal decisions that are slightly more, deliberative. For example, if I go to the supermarket and I'm trying to choose among, I don't know, brands of milk or brands of bread, well, what I'll do is I'll, look at the ingredients of this bread or that bread, but even though the options are in fact different, it's proximal. It's not in the service of anything long term, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And often it's of no consequence,
Right.
um, which is very, very unlike the distal decisions that we make about, should I go to college? If so, where should I go to college? Should I get married? If so, whom should I
Mm-hmm.
marry? If I have children, how many? So there are certain kinds of decisions that are very long term or consequential, and we tend to, deliberate very long, and deeply over such decisions. I mean, they're effectively meta decisions because they're decisions that affect everything else in life. Whether I buy this bread or that bread has really no consequence for the rest of my life, but
Yeah.
whether I marry this woman versus that woman has huge consequences for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Um, So, what I'd like to do now is to debunk a few conclusions to some famous studies before moving on to your own theories and talking about criterial causation. I don't want to spend too much time on this one because I know it's been talked the hell out of. Uh, but for Libet's experiment, it is important to sort of touch on. And to save you the boredom of repeating it over again, let me just summarize it very briefly. So, students were asked to push a button whenever they felt like it, and what surprised everyone at the time was that prior to the feeling, there was this 350 millisecond readiness potential or electrical activity in the brain for the audience that was preceding it. And so before the actual action of pressing it, there was also that additional 200 to 250 millisecond gap. And this made everyone start to believe um, that the brain had already decided before the conscious feeling of wanting to press the button. Hence, everything is quote unquote determined. Importantly, though, I will sort of say that I think whenever people talk about this, they do omit the fact that Libet himself did argue that in the 250 millisecond gap, people might not have the ability to control their thoughts or feelings, but they do have the ability potentially to veto the decision to act them out. And this led to this idea of free won't. Um, at least that's the way that I learned about it. So I'm wondering if you can, share why the readiness potential, first of all, is a red herring, and perhaps you could share your own study with Schlegel and others, and secondly, why compatibilism in this context might be incoherent.
Yeah, so thanks to Al Mealy, who started a group of philosophers and neuroscientists coming together, funded by the Templeton Foundation way back in 2010, 11 or so. My group, along with, so it was me, Walter Sinnott Armstrong, Adina Roskis, and Talia Wheatley, and our students, Alex Schlegel and Scotty Alexander. We redid pretty much most of the relevant Libet work. And, indeed, if you have somebody kind of choose some arbitrarily, some basically meaningless act, like it moved this hand versus this hand, or, that's just one example. And then if you time lock the electroencephalography signal to the motor act, right? Well, two things are relevant, right? So one is that you're asking them subjectively, when did you feel that you had the urge to move or the volition to move? And they'll say something like, if this is time zero, they'll say, let's say at minus 200 milliseconds, minus 250 milliseconds, that they felt like they were going to move. It might be minus 100 milliseconds. It doesn't matter. But we can call that time W. And we can call time zero time M, or the time of the motor act. What's interesting is that prior to time W, there is the deviation from the baseline of the EEG signal already at, say, minus 400 milliseconds. Again, the particular number doesn't matter. So that struck people as very strange, right? That, okay, it's not surprising that people would say that they intended or felt the intention or the urge to move prior to moving. But what was surprising to people was that there was some sort of evidence of brain activity that seemed predictive of the motor act prior to time W. And, in one way, this is not surprising, right? Like every motor act and every intention is realized in the brain, and so there has to be preceding motor activity. But, other people then came along and found that that this readiness potential is, might actually be some sort of artifact. So there's this very nice work by, what's his name? Aaron Scherger, and this was on that very good paper, Stan DeHaan. They argued that, in fact, the readiness potential might just be an artifact of averaging. So, to give you an analogy, in the world of decision-making, one of the most common models is this three-parameter model called the drift diffusion model. But basically, you might have some threshold for making a decision, and you have to cross that threshold. So there's going to be the rate of approach of the threshold. There's going to be the variability in crossing that threshold, and then there's the threshold. So I guess it's a three-parameter model. And they argue that if you're just time locking to, when people cross the threshold and look backward in time, well, one path might have gone like this and then cross the threshold. Another might have gone like this and cross the threshold. But if you're just time locking to hundreds of different trials that cross the threshold, of course, it's going to look like this, zoop, up to the threshold. So they made the argument that the readiness potential is just an artifact of averaging. I think it's not at all surprising that brain activity precedes any mental act, any mental operation, including intentions to move. But that doesn't mean that, I think the mistake is in saying that therefore the decision was made before consciousness played any role. You know, we wouldn't, we wouldn't make that kind of logical fallacy when it came to other forms of causation, right? So if I said, for example, the pitcher threw the ball,
Mm.
and that preceded the batter hitting the ball, and then there was a home run. So the home run, crossing the wall of the park, that would be like time m, or the motor act.
Mm.
And then preceding that is the hitter hitting the ball. That would be analogous to time w.
Mm-hmm.
And preceding that is the pitcher throwing the ball.
Right.
It would be very strange to say, well, the pitcher preceded both the batter hitting the ball and the home run, and therefore all the causal efficacy is due to the pitcher,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That seems completely lame.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just a simple logical fallacy to say that simply because there is preceding neural activity to an intention or a willing,
Mm-hmm.
that sole causal efficacy is due to that neural activity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in addition, there are lots of things that could happen prior to an act of willing or intention that simply bias you to intend one way or another, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
on that kind of logic, I know that you're a human being. I know you have biases, so I can say, well, I can predict with 90% accuracy that tonight at 3:28 a.m. you will be asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does that mean because I have this ability to predict that fact that you have no volitional control over what you do over your life? It's absurd.
Mm-hmm.
I could even go, out in time 30 years, right? So you're relatively young. I could say, you're likely to be alive in 30 years in the year 2055 on this date,
Mm-hmm.
July 3rd, at 3:28 a.m. you're likely to be asleep with a 90% probability.
Right.
Does that mean you have, that a capacity to, uh,
Mm-hmm.
make predictions,
Mm-hmm.
and because you have biases? Does that mean you have no volitional control over any aspect of your life? So this is the class of
Mm-hmm.
logical fallacies and simple absurdities, I think, that the whole field of both neurophilosophy and philosophy of neuroscience got stuck in
Right.
by zooming in on these meaningless choices, right? Because moving this hand versus this hand is not consequential at all, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
choices that really do invoke free will, where the action is in free will, is in deliberation, especially deliberation, not only over proximal decisions like choosing this bread versus this bread, but over distal decisions like whom to marry, what to do with your life, what language to learn,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of person you want to become.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so the same sort of logical errors we could say would map onto the other study by Soon and colleagues, where they concluded that they could predict up to 60% of the time, like 10 seconds before, whether people will press a button or not, depending on activation of certain areas of the brain, right? Like the frontal
Yeah,
polar and the
that
parietal areas. Yeah.
absolutely the same point, right? So
Yeah.
in 2008, Soon and my friend John Dylan Haynes,
Mm-hmm.
they made a kind of even seemingly more shocking finding than the Libet case, right? Because people, whatever, in some kind of virtual game had to choose to go down a little corridor and then go left versus right, and they were able to decode from the fMRI signal, uh, you know, so chance is 50%. So they were a little bit above chance. So let's say, I think it was 58%. They were able to decode it, they say, 10 seconds before
Mm-hmm.
whether people would go left versus right. And people said, oh my God, the brain's making decisions 10 seconds before it consciously makes decisions. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, this is the argument that your unconscious has all the causal
Causal.
decision making
Yeah.
efficacy, and consciousness is simply informed. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
deeply, deeply wrong. I mean, Sam Harris makes that kind of pretty lame argument, like consciousness plays no role at all. Again, it gets to the issue of there could be all kinds of unconscious biases. You know, I can look at the biases in the brain 10 seconds before, and you know that might tip you to go left versus right. It might tip you to be nice to somebody or grumpy towards them, right? I mean, we have all kinds of biases going on all the time. That doesn't mean we have no volitional control over what we do. It doesn't mean that we can't consider options. It doesn't mean that we cannot rein in uh, options that present themselves that we choose not to do. This is a bit like the idea of free won't from Libet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't put I mean, the main point is that people were looking for their kind of key where the light is good, that metaphor. Um, so everybody's looking for, evidence of free will in things that they can easily measure, like EEG signals.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all looking in this domain of meaningless proximal decisions, right?
Right.
Decisions that have no consequence for someone of any,
Mm-hmm.
So much more important is to look at the domain of brain activity
Mm-hmm.
and mental activity where the action is
Deliberations.
in free will, which
Right.
is volitional deliberation over options that are consequential to us.
Wonderful. Yeah, so
And
let's dive into that just after one more over here, because also there's also the Wegner study I wanted you to speak to, the I Spy experiment, where he had participants share a computer mouse with a Confederate, and they were told to stop the cursor on certain images, and sometimes the Confederate would move the mouse to a target image, but either way, the participants were primed with words related to the image just before the movement, and many of the participants then would report feeling as if they had intentionally caused the cursor to stop on the target even when they hadn't. And so Wegner concluded that the feeling of conscious will can be constructed after the fact. What was Wegner's mistake?
okay, so in this experiment, also done with Talia Wheatley, who I worked with in the free will, she was my foil because she was always a kind of hardcore determinist
It's
and
good to have one.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, um, right. So in this game of I Spy, one person is actually an experimenter, but the subject doesn't know that, and then they're co-moving this little mouse-like thing onto different words. Meanwhile, the subject is hearing just a stream of what they think is just random words, right? So the random word, it might be, house, tree, dog, cat, mouse, and then the Confederate sometimes moves it towards a word that was just spoken.
Hmm.
And then the subject is asked, why they chose that word, and they say that they moved it there on purpose, that they did that of their own volition. So it's quite interesting. I mean, I think that in fact we do create cover stories about our own actions
Hmm.
retrospectively, right? But just because we do that sometimes doesn't mean that all of our actions are cover stories
Hmm.
that we create or confabulate concerning our past actions. Um, I think that we are, in fact, often trying to understand, aspects of our own behavior and justify things after the fact. But that we do that is not proof that that is all that we do, right? I mean,
That
really,
generalization, a bit of a
what
distortion.
Wegner is doing is he's describing an illusion of volition.
Hmm.
And the one mistake he makes is this: if I said, for example, there are visual illusions, well, therefore, all of vision is an illusion, right? You would say, well, that's stupid.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously, that there are visual illusions doesn't mean that all of vision is an illusion. I think Wegener is effectively saying the analog.
Hmm.
Well, this is an illusion of volition. Therefore, all volition is an illusion. And, it's a kind of leap too far.
Hmm.
I mean, it's a similar leap to what Libet did, namely that this this choice, moving this hand versus that hand, seems to have been um, dictated, or this choice seems to have been made unconsciously, and I challenge that also. But let's just say that that's correct, right? That the choice was made unconsciously, and certainly we do make unconscious choices sometimes. Therefore, all choice, all volition is unconscious, right? Again, that's a leap too far. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just because some choices are made unconsciously doesn't prove that all choices are made unconsciously, right?
Yeah.
In fact, there is a role for consciousness in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not simply the passive recipient of unconscious processing.
Mm-hmm.
And, to those people who argue that consciousness is acausal, I can just say, okay, here's a kind of village idiot experiment. Describe to me what you're experiencing right now. And they'll say, well, my back kind of hurts and I'm kind of thirsty and I'm getting over a cold and my throat is itchy. In what kind of universe is the description of my own conscious content in no way caused by my conscious content, right? You'd have to come up with some crazy, weird
Yeah.
other story about atoms hitting atoms, such that the atoms happen to just hit themselves in the right way, and be processed unconsciously in just the right way, such that I say, my throat is itchy,
Mm-hmm.
but the fact that I experienced my throat is itchy was not causal. You know, both Libet and Wegner kind of describe, an analogy would be a sneeze, right? So, in fact, a sneeze is caused by dust in your whatever nose, and then you sneeze. And just prior to sneezing, I have this feeling that I'm about to sneeze. But in fact, that feeling of about to sneeze-ness is not the cause of me sneezing. It's actually caused by this preceding unconscious thing, namely the dust in my nose.
Mm-hmm.
So both Libet and Wegner are saying that all decisions are like that, And in the case of a sneeze, it's probably true that that my feeling of being about to sneeze is not the cause of the sneeze.
Mm-hmm.
But just because the consciousness of being about to sneeze is not the cause of the sneeze, but in fact preceding dust in my nose was the cause of the sneeze. Just because that's the case doesn't mean that consciousness never plays any role in any decisions, right? And so the
Yeah.
whole thing I think is silly, and I feel like this whole field just wasted
Right.
40 years. I mean, it's just a complete waste of time
Mm.
when the action again is in this domain of mental operations,
Mm.
especially conscious mental operations, where we play things out um, in our internal virtual reality,
Mm-hmm.
and we play out different futures, and we
Mm-hmm.
in our imagination we have we're not constrained at all by the laws of physics. We can imagine I can imagine flying, I can imagine turning into Snoopy and flying on Mars, and there's just no end to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our imagination is really where the action is in free
Mm-hmm.
will, the mental operations, and these mental operations.
Peter, sorry, could I reel us back a little bit because I had a few more questions before I wanted to jump into that.
Okay, sorry.
There's one more person I wanted you to refute a bit here, and that's of course Robert Sapolsky, who really refutes free will, believing that we're nothing more than the sum of biological and environmental luck. Could you speak to why this might be overly simplistic, especially when he considers the brain from a very linear perspective as opposed to nonlinear?
Yeah, first, I mean, it's just bewildering to me that people like Sapolsky. I mean, there's a whole class of these people, right? I'll call them the you are nothing but a meat puppet thinkers, right? And this is Robert
Right.
Sapolsky, Sam Harris, Yuval Harari, maybe Jerry Coyne. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of these people. Um, it's not. I think it's not only just utterly wrong, but also very damaging to society to have these views be so propagated.
Mm.
Um, and I think there's no justification really for it in the scientific literature at all. So if you look at Sapolsky's argument, there's nothing new philosophically. He's just basically saying, the universe is determined, therefore your choices are determined by what? By your past states and their interactions with the environment, and therefore there is no actual choice. There's just essentially almost like a Buddhist unfolding. It's basically, shit happens, and so there can be no blame, right? I mean, really, if you there are more refined arguments along these lines from true philosophers like Greg Caruso or Neil Levy, which are much more sophisticated than Sapolsky's arguments. I mean, Sapolsky just, what bothers me about the whole thing is that someone like Sapolsky takes the credibility that he has from being a top behavioral biologist, and then he's using it in the domain of philosophy, but he's doing poor philosophy. And people buy this stuff, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm just a meat puppet. I might as well just do nothing." What do they say? They say you're nothing more. It's always you're nothing more than a biochemical puppet. So but the basic argument, from a more sophisticated philosophical point of view, can be found in Neil Levy's Hard Luck book. So what does that book say? It says something along the lines of it's a version of the so-called luck argument. So the luck argument is that you come to the world with a certain constitution. You can call that your constitutive luck. You have a certain genetics, and you didn't choose that. You have a certain environment. Well, you didn't choose that either. And then at the moment that any choice is made, well, it comes down to the things that you didn't choose. Like there's another argument along these lines. Let's see. What's his name? Peter van Inwagen, who's not one of these people, but he is a philosopher who poses. He does believe in a form of free will. He imagines a thief who is looking at a church box full of money and pondering whether to steal the money or not. And he's torn. He's saying, well, I promised my mother on her deathbed that I would try to lead a more moral life, and I swore to her that I would never steal again. So that's one desire he has inside of him. And then the other desire he has inside of him is to steal the money because he wants the money. And then the argument from, say, Neil Levy would be that, at the moment of choice, between these two torn desires, it's just like a coin flip, and so this would not be your so you either have constitutive luck or you have this sort of proximal luck of like flipping a coin. And I think that entire class of arguments fails because we are not simply driven by our constitution, namely our genetics. We're not solely driven by our environment. We're also driven by our own decision-making, which is itself influencing the realization of the potential we came to the world with. So you might say that we are ourselves part of the environment, which then plays a role in the realization of our genetically given potential, right? So what's given genetically is not an outcome, but a potential. And, our own decisions, like, whether to learn Swahili or not, play a role in whether the potential for learning any language, which is, genetically given, and a cat doesn't have that, but we do. Me deciding to learn Swahili plays a role in me then learning Swahili. So the whole program of a biological determinist like Sapolsky is rooted first in the wrong assumption that the world is determined, but also it's an incredibly linear view of the of neural activity. So I would say Sapolsky is essentially a quasi-Newtonian thinker. So causation in the brain is very non-Newtonian, right? So under Newton, ball A hits ball B, and ball B has very little say in the matter of what happens. given this momentum and mass, and boom, this ball will do this. And a very similar linear mode of thinking is operative among many neuroscientists. Action potential, so a neuron fires. Action potential A hits, neuron B, and neuron B fires as well. So it's like instead of ball A hitting ball B, it's action potential A triggering action potential B. But there's something entirely missing from this view, which is the nonlinear interactions that go on between neurons. So, for example, neurons don't simply respond passively to their inputs. They evaluate their inputs based upon criteria for assessment that they have. Sorry, I have a cold. So, getting back to a billiard ball game, this would be like a very nonlinear, weird, non-Newtonian billiard ball game where billiard ball B has some conditionality imposed upon its inputs such that it's evaluating them, and it says, well, okay, if billiard ball A is even and striped, I'll do this, and if it's even and solid, I'll do that, and if it's odd and striped, I'll do this other thing, and if it's odd and whatever striped, whatever, I'll do nothing, or if it's the black ball, I'll do nothing. So there's all kinds of informational conditionality placed upon the inputs in that very strange billiard ball game, and that's what in fact neurons are doing. They're not responding to the mass or the power of their input in any sense. They're responding to patterns in their input, and those patterns realize informational facts.
Peter, let me ask you something.
Anyway, to get to Sapolsky, I think he's wrong about determinism. He's wrong about how the neural code works, and he then jumps to the conclusion. Therefore, and this is where he does bad philosophy. Therefore, no decisions you make. First of all, you have no choice in what you have no say in the matter of what happens in your life, and everything you did is not your fault. And the consequence of, say, Neil Levy's argument or Sapolsky's argument, I think, is a deep nihilism. That everything is just chance or luck. Yeah, Hitler, he killed 60 million people, in World War II, 8 million Jews. Oh, the Holocaust, well, that happened. Yeah, bad luck. Give me a break. I just think the whole thing is absurd.
Right.
And this kind of nihilism needs to be confronted because it's not only wrong, it's damaging to people.
Right.
I've gotten literally hundreds of emails from people, saying they've read Sam Harris or Sapolsky, and, they feel depressed because they feel now that they are nothing more than a meat puppet. And this has to be confronted because it's not only wrong, it's damaging.
Yeah, it's wrong and damaging, and there's a fair amount of empirical literature supporting the benefits of believing free will and the disadvantages of not believing in it. Let's go back to this idea of criterial causation. There's a process that I was curious to know why it wasn't in your book, actually. There's a neural process called retrograde signaling, whereby the postsynaptic neuron sends signals back to the presynaptic neuron, often through chemical messengers like endocannabinoids or nitric oxide or BNF. So for the audience, so these retrograde messengers, they travel back to the presynaptic neuron and instruct the presynaptic neuron to potentially adjust for its future behavior. Is this, or could this be considered an example of criterial causation, or would that?
Well, that's actually very interesting, right? So look, criterial causation is realized in all kinds of mechanisms that allow a neuron to evaluate its input. And, that could be changes in the threshold. It could be changes in synaptic weights at a long time scale, like long-term potentiation. It could be short time scales, like the opening of NMDA receptors, right? That would be millisecond time scale rapid synaptic reweighting. And then, endocannabinoids and other mechanisms that allow a neuron to alter its future inputs. Are also very important. I mean, at a gross scale, neurons do change their own inputs by communicating with other neurons. That could be the presynaptic neuron, or it could be other neurons that will in the future feed input to them. And here would be another example. This wouldn't be a local neural interaction, but a more global one, where let's say I'm looking for my daughter on a beach, and there's thousands of people, and I only know that she is wearing a red bathing suit. Well, I can pay attention to red things,
Mm.
and then my search set is much smaller. That is probably realized in a mechanism whereby neurons, maybe in visual area one, but I don't know, feed back to the thalamus,
Mm.
the LGN or lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and turn up the signal or the gain
Yeah.
or the volume, so to speak, on redness, and maybe turn down the gain on other colors. That
Mm.
would be the cortex taking control of its own future inputs.
Right. Right.
But yeah, anyway, getting back to the endocannabinoid system, yeah, I think that that's another mechanism.
Okay.
And it's not only neurons influencing other neurons concerning their future inputs. It's also glial cells, right? So people generally don't talk about glial cells, but
Yeah.
actually, you have more glial
Yeah.
cells
They
than
outnumber.
neurons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're doing really important stuff. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so probably the most important receptor in the brain, I would say, there's lots of important receptors, but the one that's most interesting to me is this NMDA receptor. And it is a kind of coincidence detector, just as a neuron at a much larger scale is also a coincidence detector.
Mm.
What the NMDA receptor is looking for is the coincidence of three facts. First, the neuron has to already be somewhat depolarized
Mm-hmm.
due to previous AMPA receptor opening. Uh, Glutamate has to be binding to the NMDA receptor, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter.
Mm.
And there has to be this other thing called glycine or D-serine binding to the NMDA receptor. So if those three things are true, existing depolarization, sorry, for your audience, depolarization means, an increase in the voltage across the membrane from
It,
baseline.
it's excitation. Yeah.
Excitation,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
So given some pre-existing excitation and glutamate binding to the receptor and glycine or D-serine binding to the receptor, then the donut-like receptor will open and allow massive influx of positively charged ions, sodium and calcium in this case. Well, it turns out that glial cells they are the ones that release this chemical, D-serine. And so they can function effectively as a circuit breaker, right? So let's say there's just massively too much neural activity going on. They can stop releasing this key chemical, and the NMDA receptor won't open no matter how much input it's getting in
Mm.
terms of glutamate.
Mm-hmm.
So the glial cells have this, veto power, or it's almost functioning like a fuse breaker or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A circuit, I'm not, any like a fuse, So that would also be an example of altering the criteria whereby a neuron will fire.
Mm-hmm.
So there's probably dozens and dozens of mechanisms whereby
Right.
neurons, the criteria that lead to a neuron firing are influenced. The ones that are of most interest to me are the ones that are realizing informational criteria.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's talk about information. I know you have a bit of a different perspective of information in relationship to patterns and decoders. Perhaps you could speak to that.
Right. Okay. So let's take a big picture view, right? If you look at non-biological nature, so suns and tables and rocks, most of the causation can be understood in terms of two key aspects of energy, namely amplitude and frequency.
Mm.
But what biology hit upon was this other thing, which is the phase of energy. So what is phase? Phase is about a relationship. So you can have temporal phase relationships. So for example, my two fingers are in sync, they're in phase.
Mm.
Now they're completely out of phase, or
Mm.
they could be 90 degrees out of phase, or they can have no phase relationship. There's just there's just no relationship. So phase is about the relationship of two things in time or space.
Mm.
So you can talk about temporal phase relationships like simultaneity. Um, And you can talk about phase relationships in space, like shape. So in both cases, phase relationships in terms of timing and phase relationships in terms of shape are absolutely essential to how neurons function.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that this sort of sensitivity to relationships among energetic inputs is what got life going,
Right.
So let's go all the way down to the level of a receptor. Well, a receptor might respond to the shape. So that's a spatial phase relationship. You have some molecule, like say serotonin, it has, some complex shape, but there's going to be something like this little key and this little lock. And if that matches, boop, the receptor will open.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out that, only that little key part of the input molecule matters. If the molecule has a different shape over here, it doesn't really matter. It's like a key. A key can be made of lots of different, it can be made of steel, platinum, gold, but it can have lots of different shapes. The only key part is the key part. So it turns out, for example, that a serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor responds to serotonin, which it evolved to respond to. But then there's all these interesting chemicals called hallucinogens that also open the 5-HT2A receptor. And for the brain, it is as if, if you take psilocybin, psilocin, ayahuasca,
LSD also.
LSD, mescaline, all these things have the key bit, has the same shape as serotonin. So as far as your brain is concerned, it's like getting a massive amount of serotonergic input, right? Anyway, so that's a phase relationship in space. Now, going up to the level of a neuron, the neural code is most fundamentally a pattern detection code, and the pattern that is of most significance to a neuron is simultaneity, or simultaneous inputs across the dendritic branches. So neurons typically have a resting potential. Let's take a pyramidal cell. It'll have a resting potential of something like minus 70 millivolts. And in order to fire, it has to depolarize or become more positively charged inside the neuron relative to outside the neuron of, say, minus 55 millivolts, right? So, but if you get a single spike input from a presynaptic neuron to your postsynaptic neuron, it might just only go up, let's say, I don't know, 4 or 5 millivolts. But then it'll decay quickly. Right? This is called an excitatory postsynaptic potential. And it decays because there are these active sodium pumps that are actively pushing positively charged ions out. So interestingly, if I have a single spike, well, I might go from minus 70 millivolts up to whatever, minus 65, say. And then it'll decay because of those active sodium pumps. And then it is as if that spike never happened. I mean, neurons effectively have no memory in that sense. They're constantly pumping out positively charged ions that lead to depolarization. Oh, pump them out, back to baseline. So in order to reach the threshold of minus 55 millivolts, I might need, let's say, for a typical pyramidal cell, say 5 spikes arriving at the same time. So then I get one EPSB, they add up, EPSB, 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 boom, boom. Then I hit minus 55 and boom, I have an action potential.
Right.
Now, how do I get 5 spikes at the same time? Well, there's different ways. One is to have
spatial or temporal summation, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you could have 5 neurons, 5 different presynaptic neurons all arriving at the same time. So that is synchrony. So synchrony is almost surely a very important part of the neural code. Another way is to have a single neuron fire like crazy all at once, like grrr. And that's called bursting. So bursting is also likely to be a very fundamental part of the neural code. But the neural code, right, it's not only about action potentials. I mean, action potentials are half the story because they provide the possibility of a pattern. But they are not alone enough because you need to have the postsynaptic neuron evaluating inputs. both for their simultaneity and whether they satisfy the informational criteria that drives the neuron.
Mm.
Yeah, so the neural code is fundamentally criterial, right? An action potential per se is not criterial, but the evaluation of action potentials is criterial. That is to say, it's evaluated for patterns of input.
Right, right.
And, an analogy that I like is that you can think of action potentials or neural spikes as the energy passing through the system. You need that, right? Like that would be analogous to my voice box or my vocal cords vibrating. You need energy
Mm-hmm.
to be able to speak. But in addition, you also need, this level of filtering, which is how I move my mouth prior to the energy coming through. So if I were to only measure, the energy passing through the system, I would get but if I were to measure only the filtering, which is very fast and dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
of my mouth moving, because that's effectively silent, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, again, in neuroscience, we're kind of looking for our keys where the light is good. We're looking at action potentials in the hope that the neural code will be something
Mm-hmm.
that we can decode from action potentials, like a Morse code or something. And that's never going to pan out because there's this invisible filtering going on, which is these rapid synaptic weight changes going on in dendrites. So the neural code is very fundamentally a dendritic code, a dendritic evaluation code, a dendritic reweighting code.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't really even have good mechanisms for looking at those decisions in the dendrites. So, for example, I would say the best work being done in this domain right now is Matt Larkham's work at Humboldt University in Berlin. And he's looking at questions of simultaneity among basal dendrites and apical dendrites. Right, so a pyramidal cell has a pyramid-shaped cell body, then it has these little dendrites coming off the base, but it also has dendrites going up into the apex, and then you've got the axon going down. But even within just the basal dendrites, you have really important decisions happening that realize effectively something like a Boolean logic. So, for example, if you look at the basal dendrites or the apical dendrites, but if you look at the basal dendrites, one branch will come off the cell body, and then it'll branch, usually in two, and then it'll branch in two, right? So consider one of those forks, right? So I don't know. This is dendritic branch one. This is dendritic branch two. This is then the branch that goes into the cell body.
Yeah.
Well, in order to depolarize this branch that goes into the cell body, if only this one gets depolarized, like gets a spike, that might not make it depolarize. If only this one depolarizes, it might not work. But maybe both need to be depolarized, and only then, if this and this are depolarized, will this one depolarize. Now you can, extend the logic, right? So this is also a fork, and so forth. Now, other people, including Christoph Koch, many others, have realized that this kind of process can realize a kind of set of logic gates, where you can realize AND gates, OR gates, XOR gates, and so forth. Now you can have a neuron, I don't know, let's arbitrarily choose a face-tuned neuron in, say, inferotemporal cortex. I mean, in humans, we have this fusiform face area where the neurons are really responding massively to faces.
Yeah.
Well, neurons don't respond, those neurons are not responding to anything in the world. They're responding to their inputs, right? So, and those neurons are responding to their inputs and so forth. So, the earliest neurons in the cascade will be the ganglion cells in the retina, and they're going to respond to something like, a black dot on a white background or something. So like effectively a dot detector. Well, then you go up to V1 and you get something like a bar detector or a moving bar detector. Then you go to V2, you might get something like a shape detector, it's sort of like this hierarchy, this cascade of, this is like Selfridge's pandemonium model, or any of these feed-forward stack models, that you can, like the HMAX model, for example, you have like an eye detector, a nose detector, a mouth detector. Eventually you end up with this face detector. But you can imagine at the level of the face neuron, it might say, well, if I get eye detector inputs at the same time as I get mouth detector inputs, then I'll say, yes, there's a face there. And I don't think anybody deeply understands how exactly those criteria are realized in dendrites. I think there's a huge amount of future work to do to try to really decode the information processing in the dendrites.
Right.
And no amount of analysis of action potentials is going to solve the problem when action potentials are. I mean, what are action potentials are the outputs of the system when a neuron says, yeah, that which I'm tuned to, I've detected. So they're very important, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient for understanding how the brain works.
Right.
The problem is that we don't really have the technical means really to understand all this information processing at the level of dendritic computations.
So
but we know they must exist. I mean, there's these incredible neurons that Itzhak-Fried and Quiroga, I think, and Christoph Koch and others have found in these.
concepts neuron.
Yeah, it's just incredible, right? Like, so you have in the hippocampus, in this case, a neuron that will fire, let's say, to the voice of Oprah Winfrey,
Right.
the word Oprah Winfrey, a picture of Oprah Winfrey, recalling Oprah Winfrey. Right. So there's, but then, 10 minutes later, that same neuron might respond to Jennifer Aniston. Right. So it's not a fixed code, it's a very dynamic code. So we know that this kind of incredible flexibility and high-level criteriality exists, but how it's actually realized, like how you actually create a neuron in the hippocampus that temporarily is responding to the concept of Oprah Winfrey, I don't think there's a deep understanding of that.
Right.
But it surely has to do with rapid synaptic weight changes among dendrites, I think.
Yeah. So, Peter, I'd like us to zoom out from this neural perspective and look into three core circuits that you mentioned, one of which I'm very excited to hear a little more about. You talk about the frontal parietal regions, the default mode network, and the basal ganglia, which you kind of touched on a little bit from a neural perspective. But you propose them to be very important for free will. And sort of related to what you said, actually, so the DMN is something that I studied at. It was my dissertation was on the DMN, and so was a study that I ran at University of Miami. And one of the fascinating things related to free will is this idea that when people are recalling a memory and people are looking at brain activity related to that, and then they are asked to simulate the future event, they find that these different memory traces are simply being recombined in different ways in order to actually project a potential simulated future, which tends to show that memory is not actually to create or hold an accurate historical record of the past, but it's actually for the future. And I thought that was an interesting, crosstalk with some of your work with free will. But in any case, the DMN, I call it the MOTS network, related to mental time travel, others, and the self. The social cognition, self-referential is just an acronym. But in any case, for those other circuits, including the DMN, how do you sort of put those together from that sort of more macroscopic perspective of how those relate to free will?
Right. Yeah. So, this is a system that has many parts, and each plays a very important role, and each is probably necessary but not sufficient for creating a volitional decision. But, let me give you an analogy, right? Like if I want to, go to some destination, I have to have a driver, and I have to have a destination in mind, and then I also need gas, and I need a car that works, right? Like the whole thing has to function.
Yeah.
So we can talk about these different circuits in sequence, I guess. So the default mode network, I mean, it's this beautiful circuit, a modular circuit, effectively, that is, I think of something like our internal virtual reality engine that allows us to imagine or to recreate the past. I mean, even the past is reconstructed. And what do people tend to think about? They tend to think about themselves, they tend to think about their friends, and they tend to think about, why stuff happened or why, how things will turn out, right? So that's just our default mode. And, when Mark Rakel kind of
Rachel.
stumbled upon this.
Yeah.
He's like, wow, when we give somebody a task, this thing goes down, and when we have people just rest in the scanner, this thing goes up. So it seems to be like the default mode. And initially, people were saying, well, it's the self network, and I mean, probably just that we tend to think of ourselves and interactions with others a lot. But really, I think of it as our internal virtual reality engine, and the really key part of it, I think, is the posterior cingulate. But there's other parts of it.
Yeah.
I mean, in order to have a virtual reality, you have to tie in with the whole hippocampal system to download things that you can imagine. But the posterior cingulate seems to be really a central hub. Sorry, in internally generating possibilities.
Yeah.
Whether those are possibilities concerning what happened in the past, like why did she say that to me, or why did they do that, or concerning the future, it's like, what should I make for dinner tonight? Well, I want to invite 6 people and make it half men, half women. How about those 3 and those 3? Oh, no, but he went out with her and they broke up. Okay, take him out. Like, put in this other guy. Like, this kind of deliberation is constantly on our. Actually, the work of Jonathan Schooler and I forget the other guy's name, show that we spend about half of our waking life in that mode of kind of pondering the future or the past internally, right? So consciousness consciousness is bifurcated, right? Our consciousness is either this internal virtual reality, sort of, and then there, again, it's bifurcated in the virtual reality. It's like there's the sleeping version of the, REM sleep and dreams. Then there's the waking dreams of mind wandering. So, okay, so that's the role of the default mode network, and clearly for deliberation, that's absolutely an essential component. But that alone is not enough to implement a volitional plan or intention, right?
Right.
I mean, we all know people who spend their whole life mind wandering and never carry it out, right? Like, there's people who always aim and never shoot, and but then there's other people who always shoot and never aim, right? You need both aiming and shooting, right? You need to deliberate, but not only deliberate. Now, then you also need an executive that can take any plan or come up with a plan, so you can kind of have mind-wandering deliberative playing things out, which plays a role in forming a plan, or you can have a sort of more rational top-down form of planning. I would say that's realized in part in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and probably area 10, right behind our foreheads. And this is part of the frontoparietal control network, which itself, there's different parts to it, right? So yes, you need a driver that has a plan, and it can invoke deliberation or imagination as part of that. But then you also need what in the old days they called willpower. You need sort of like gas in the tank, the ability to actually carry it out. And for that, you need a body that works, right? I mean, if you have locked-in syndrome, you can deliberate all day and come up with great decisions, but you can't implement it, right? So having a motoric system that functions is necessary as well, like a car that has functioning chassis and so forth. Now, what's of interest to me in this, let's call it the willpower system, Steve Peterson and Dozenbach and Peterson and others call it the cingulo-opercular system. So the anterior cingulate contains circuitry that seems to be necessary for what in the old days they called willpower.
Right.
Now, interestingly, this is tied up in many, with this feeling of fire in the belly, and what's his name? Hugo Critchley and others have argued that the anterior cingulate might actually be the encephalization or the cortical component of the invocation of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous systems. And so, the right dorsal anterior cingulate, like maybe, an inch behind this point in my forehead,
Mm.
medially allows me to invoke the fire in the belly, right? So if
Mm.
I have an intention to go get water, I need to activate my sympathetic nervous system, get up and, move.
Right.
Now, what people realize is, if you knock out that part of the cingulate, if I gave you an anterior cingulotomy, which they used to do to um, cingulotomies are these terrible. I mean, frontal lobotomies were a very crude version of that.
Mm.
People would become utterly listless, unmotivated. They wouldn't
Possible.
talk, and they actually came up with the fancy term akinetic mutism
Mm.
because they weren't talking and they weren't moving.
Mm.
But they didn't become unconscious, right? You
Mm.
knocked out this willpower circuit.
Mm.
You're no longer able to invoke the motivation to implement a plan, whether realized through deliberation or, rational considerations,
Mm.
because you've knocked out the circuitry that allows the invocation of your sympathetic nervous system in this case. And then sometimes people would get better, and then they'd ask them, why did you say anything or do anything for whatever, a year? And they say, well, nothing mattered.
Mm.
There's no point. Anyway, so I would say, crudely speaking, all of these circuits play a role in volition.
Right.
So, a plan is like having
Mm.
a driver who, knows what the plan is.
Mm.
Uh, you know, the vision of where you want to go, that's maybe realized through, default mode network
Right.
deliberation. The cingulo-opercular circuit is analogous to having gas in the car,
Right.
and they're all necessary for you to go out and do something in the world
Mm.
or in your own mind, volitionally.
Right. Okay. So I wanted to present something to you and see what your thoughts are on this, because so I'm a clinician also, and um, I don't know. I've been thinking about this, and I wanted to hear your thoughts. So a patient, let's say, comes into my office and they're a victim of childhood trauma, right? They develop expectations that the world is a dangerous place and they must be strong regardless of how, and they become themselves a perpetrator, let's say, as a learned behavior and also to prevent themselves from ever being a victim again. And so let's say I help them realize that they have not only become the person that they despise, but are still victims because they are psychologically still submitting to the influence of the person who abused them in the first place. And so with this awareness, let's say, and some time and experience, they're then able to transcend a maladaptive pattern that they were engaged in before. Would you agree with the statement that while this person has free will, the level of freedom was constrained by parameters and that the insight enabled a reparameterization that granted them a greater level of freedom?
Oh, sure. That
Oh,
makes complete sense.
okay.
I mean, to say that we have free will doesn't mean we have unconstrained freedom of a God, right? We're all deeply constrained, and some people are much more constrained than others, right? Some are motorically constrained, like locked-in syndromes.
Mm.
Some are psychologically constrained,
Hmm.
like this person you're talking about.
Right, right.
And then, there are probably multiple ways of helping people get beyond maladaptive patterns. I mean, I would think, in the clinical line of work,
Mm.
the first step has to be to help people realize that there is such a pattern.
Yeah.
I mean, I think often people are just blind to their pattern. And, this is the role of therapists, but also friends,
Hmm.
of elders in the community saying, don't you see what you're doing?
Right.
Um, and scaffolding people to their own insights, I think, is very powerful.
Hmm.
Um, then there might be other pathways. Like I think, psilocybin is a very promising pathway. So it seems that, but it has to be done very well and
Hmm.
with wisdom. So, for example, evolution seems to have come up with the following strategy for committing to the world, right? It doesn't know beforehand what world it's going to be born into.
Hmm.
And so it is highly plastic during early childhood and then adapts itself, it fine tunes itself to the particular world it finds itself in. So, by analogy, for example, let's say I build a new university,
Mm.
and I have no idea where to put the sidewalks. Well, what I do is I put grass everywhere,
Mm.
and I say, students, just walk, and after, one semester, it's going to be pretty clear where the trails form. Then I put down my sidewalks. I put down my cement. So it's two stages. There's a
Right.
highly plastic stage, then there's
Mm.
a committed stage. Now,
Mm.
evolution, especially in mammals and some advanced birds, but um, seems to have this strategy
Mm.
where uh, small um, children or baby animals are incredibly plastic, but they're almost always playful in that domain where they're trying to learn. And so they're essentially, walking on the grass
Mm.
through playing and pretending to do this behavior versus that. And then once the neural circuitry has seen, the path,
Mm.
it commits. And at the level of, this even leads to changes in circuitry, even at the level of receptors. Like there's NMDA receptors that are associated with a highly plastic state, and then they're switched. Subunits are switched in to have a more committed state. Now,
Mm.
let's say you're I don't know, a woman or a man, it doesn't matter, who was subject to sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Well, in that child's mind, um, let's say it was, some kind of a girl was, sexually abused by her father. Like, it's crazy that this stuff happens, but it happens, right? And
Yeah.
so, um, what has that girl learned? That love and protection is also associated with sexual abuse,
Sexuality
right?
and abuse. Yeah.
Being victimized. Well, then the grass is replaced by sidewalks, metaphorically speaking, that are totally maladaptive, right? So such a woman might want to get into a relationship where, for the sake of love, where the man is abusive,
Mm.
because that feels most natural. Um, so what I find hopeful about psilocybin is that in what's her name? Guldolan. Um, I believe she's at Hopkins.
Mm.
She has made the argument that psilocybin puts us back into the critical period, the
Right.
period of incredible plasticity.
Mm.
Now, that could be an incredibly powerful potential relearning mechanism, right? So
Mm.
if I can take all the sidewalks and turn them back into grass,
Right.
maybe people can relearn their patterns, right? So they can get out of maladaptive patterns and learn more adaptive patterns. But this would have to be done with great wisdom, because let's say it's Charles Manson, who's giving you psilocybin or
Yeah.
LSD,
Mm-hmm.
and you put it back into the critical period, and then he effectively rewires you to regard him as, some satanic
Yeah.
cult god.
Right.
So I think that, the advent of the hallucinogens, I mean, it's incredible that they exist,
Yeah.
that some chemical in a plant or a fungus has this effect on us.
Mm.
But, if it is true, and I don't know that it's true, but if it is true, what Gould Dolan says, that psilocybin puts the brain back into a more plastic state,
Right.
then it's absolutely essential that these tools for growth uh, or transformation be done wisely. So we have a real need for wisdom
Mm-hmm.
beyond simple. I mean, right now they're kind of out of control. People are simply taking them, like
Yeah.
magic mushrooms.
Yeah. That's why
Um,
I've always been kind of against the use of them recreationally, but under a controlled setting with, like you said, someone who's very wise with the right intentions, you know,
yeah,
taking these
but we
subjects.
don't have that. I mean, so this is why we need to create effectively
Mm.
frameworks. What in the old days they would call a religion, but it wouldn't be a religion necessarily having to do with belief,
Right.
but with practices, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, actually, this is something I'm very hopeful about, is,
Right.
the transformation of uh, human spirituality away from believing things that are, nowadays simply not believable. Who can believe this stuff?
Mm.
A big man in the sky, or a
Mm.
hell, full of fire. People have gone away from that,
Mm-hmm.
but they have gone away from spiritualities based upon unbelievable beliefs
Mm-hmm.
to ones based upon practices.
Right.
Now, such practices have always existed, But we're, one byproduct of globalization is that, we are now inheritors of all the practices of all the cultures of the world. And there's lots of amazing ones, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Out of the Native American traditions of primarily, Mesoamerica and South America, we have this path of peyote, mescaline, and so forth. But
Right.
if it can be done wisely, I think it could be very powerful. But then there's other practices like meditation, yoga,
Hmm.
Sabbath, and I think that we are now in a process of recreating the world that is going to emphasize human transformation through practices
Mm.
and wisdom rather than simply belief.
Right. So, talking about belief, there's lots of talk about consciousness. And to this day, there are many other theorists coming out that are, in a sense, um, trying to combat physicalism and reintroducing ideas like panpsychism and idealism. Donald Hoffman comes to mind, who I talked to also not recently, but almost a year ago now, I think. And Bernardo Kastrup for idealism, and a bunch of others. I'm wondering, if you can share your own views. I know that at least in your book you talked about yourself as a physicalist, right? And I know that you've defined consciousness, if I get this right, as the domain of information realized in the brain that voluntary attention can operate on, right, or attend to both. So how do you respond to this question that I hear quite often, like, how does something purely physical, without any interior qualities, create an inner domain that can ponder free will and the universe and experience wonder without the supposition that there was already some interiority or some experiential nature to begin with? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think people have again and again fallen into I don't want to call it a trap, but it's in order for consciousness to have emerged in us, there has to be some potential. I mean, certainly there has to be a potential for consciousness, but it doesn't have to be realized in a sort of microscopic consciousness of, atoms or quarks or strings. I mean,
hmm,
going way back, I mean, ideas like this are always floating around, like
hmm.
Alfred North Whitehead's idea of,
Yeah, I'm actually a fan of his.
yeah, I like process philosophy too. And, but,
Okay.
no, but, before that, Leibniz's monads and,
Yeah. Mm,
Indra's net, I mean, there's sort of notions like this going around all the time, or the, various forms of idealism, panpsychism. The idea is, well, since we can't really understand how consciousness evolved in us,
mm,
it must be part of the universe itself, right? But I mean, I think that a kind of common sense view is that tables are not experiencing anything. They're not conscious.
mm,
My cup here is not experiencing
mm.
anything, at least in any way like I am.
Right.
So, yeah, I do believe that consciousness is the result of neural activity in our case. I'm not saying that we can't create realize consciousness in other formats, but the only existence proof we have is our own body and brain.
Mm,
So I've been, I've spent, I don't know, 35 something years focused on kind of two issues. One is the set of mental operations that go into the construction of consciousness,
mm,
and then this set of mental operations that operate over conscious operands. So
mm,
let's look at the first part. Let's say light hits your retina at time zero.
mm.
Well, your conscious experience of that is not at time zero, right? It's quite a bit later. And
Yeah.
we've done experiments and find it's a quarter, probably more like a third of a second later.
Mm,
And a good example of that would be apparent motion, right? So when, let's say you look at a police car and the lights are going blink, 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 blink. What you experience is zoop, 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 right?
right.
Now, cognitively, you know that there's no light bulb moving, but it sure looks that way. It
Mm-hmm.
looks like the light is jumping back and forth. But, in fact, there's no light in the center. So when you see this motion of the lights going back and forth, that's entirely a construction.
Right.
Now,
Parent motion. Yeah.
when the second light came on,
Mm,
I'm sorry, when the first light comes on, blink, you can't know that there will be a second light.
mm,
So when you see, to account for the fact that you see motion, it must be that when the second light came on, some neural process said, aha, well, that's a change in state of that, and therefore we'll construct a motion path from there to there.
mm.
Now, then, how long can apparent motion, how late can it be after the first one? So if this one appears, and then 20 minutes later, this one appears, you're not going to see apparent motion.
Mm-hmm.
So very, very simple experiments can look at, what's the threshold in time for seeing apparent motion. Again, it's like a quarter to a third of a second.
Right.
So this suggests that prior to conscious experience, there's this whole complex, incredibly complex set of mental operations comparing things over space and time and for meaning and all kinds of things in order to construct a story basically about what's going on, right? And to see things as they are most likely are, right? So the mantra here would be seeing is seeing as. We tend to see things as a fully interpreted scene, right? We have a
Precompiled, in your words, right?
precompiled, yeah. So you have this pattern of essentially a pixel representation that's 2D on your retina, and what you experience is a 3D world, right? That has to happen within that quarter to a third of a second, such that you then see the world. And so we can talk about essentially two kinds of inference. One is pre-conscious inference, and the other is post-conscious inference. So, when I go outside of my building here, like it's raining now, I go out and I see the ground is wet. I don't think, oh, well, it's shiny here and dark there, therefore it must be wet. I see it interpreted as the ground is wet. Now, there's no cement on my retina, there's no rain.
Wetness. Yeah.
Right, but so that full interpretation is of the ground is wet is the result of pre-conscious, unconscious inferences. So we'll call them pre-conscious inferences. They go into the construction of my conscious experience. And, sometimes they're wrong, right? I see things that I know are not there, or I don't see things that I know are there, and so there's classes of visual illusions that are sort of mistakes that the system makes in its inferential processing that are kind of cues to the normal processing going on. And so I've been very interested in visual illusions for that reason. So let's say I go outside, I see the ground is wet. I say, oh, it must have rained. But then I say, oh, wait a second, actually the sky is blue. Well, maybe it didn't rain. Maybe a gardener came by and hosed it down. Oh, but wait, today's Sunday. Probably not. Maybe it's something else. So post-conscious inferential processing, trying to infer, given the evidence, what happened, is open-ended. You can, in principle, have minutes or hours of inferential processing.
Right.
So consciousness plays a role, right? It's all this pre-conscious inferential processing realized in mental operations that are comparing, say, a light here and a light here, and inferring that there must be a single object that moves, and then creating the motion that must have happened given that inferential outcome. It's the same object. It went from here to here, must be. So I infer motion. I construct a motion that is not in the input, right? There's no actual motion signal in the input. Leads to a world. That is my conscious experience of a world, right? Yeah. Animals need to have a world in which to operate. So consciousness is effectively our world. It's our perceptual world and our feelings of, having a body in the world, subjective feelings that evaluate the world, hunger, other desires and emotions, right? So that is the result of all that pre-conscious, rapid inferential processing. And it tends to represent what is most likely the case given the prior assumptions or priors of the unconscious processing. Yes, it can be wrong sometimes, but in general, it's pretty darn good, right?
Yeah.
And evolution has operated on those pre-conscious, unconscious operations massively so that we essentially construct or even hallucinate the world veridically. So you can think of consciousness as a veridical hallucination that sometimes gets it wrong, like, hallucinations and visual illusions and stuff. But then you have to do something with this, because now you're in a body in a world, right? Now, we're not experiencing the world in itself, like the Kantian Noumena, das Ding an sich, but it's probably a very good representation of it. It's so good that it is as if we see the world in itself, right? Okay. Like when you're calling your parents, you can think about the causation. Like there's a membrane which turns into a voltage, which turns into like a radio signal that goes to a transceiver, goes out to some satellite, all at the speed of light. That's not how you operate, right? You operate as if you're directly talking to your mom.
Right.
It feels like that. Even the chain of causation is not that.
Mm-hmm.
Your consciousness is a little bit like that. The construction is so incredibly good
Mm-hmm.
that it is as if we see the world in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, most people and animals operate that way.
Mm-hmm.
But
So,
then you have to do something. You have to do something with your consciousness, right? You have to make decisions like, oh, should I go left? Should I go right? What does this mean? And then you carry out other mental operations that are not pre-conscious mental operations, but post-conscious mental operations over those conscious operands. And I think the queen operator is volitional attention, choosing to attend to this versus that, tied in with eye movements. Anyway, I'll stop there.
okay. So, well, let me first ask you, how much time do you have left for us?
No, I'm fine. I just got back from Hong Kong, so I'm a little bit jet lagged, but
Okay.
I'm okay.
You're good on time? Okay, because I have a few more things I wanted to ask. So, firstly, in response to what you said, there is a lot of people right now that's really moving towards indirect realism. This idea that what we see out there is actually not vertical whatsoever, that we only see that which suits our survival, and that which suits our survival does not need to have that vertical quality. Namely, because if we did see most of reality as it actually is, it would take too much time and consume too much resource for us to actually move forward. Well, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's quite reasonable. I mean, a couple of thoughts. What we tend to represent is what is intrinsically true,
Mm,
right? So, for example, with color constancy, I'm trying to recover the intrinsic reflectance properties or pigment
mm,
properties of the substance, so that a red apple looks red under, all different color lights.
right.
And so there has to be some kind of stage that discounts the irrelevant, to recover what's intrinsically true. I think various constancy operations go into the construction of consciousness
Mm,
that result in our ultimately having a representation of what is intrinsically the true shape of an object, the true material of an object, the actual pigments of an object,
mm,
the actual distance of an object from me to the extent possible. So I'm trying to recover what's intrinsically true,
mm-hmm.
so that I have, I would say, an accurate representation of what's out there in the world so I can operate on it, right? If I misrepresent things, and I think that that's paint, but in fact it's a whole, I
Mm,
might fall to my death if
right.
I'm a monkey, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So recovering what's intrinsically true has been enormously selected for.
Mm,
But that doesn't mean that we have to recover everything that's intrinsically true. I mean,
right.
partly it's simply a matter of what I can detect, right? So I can't detect magnetic field lines, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
imagine that, get up in the morning, like, honey, look at the magnetic field lines today, they're amazing.
Right.
But sometimes they become kind of visible through like aurora borealis, and we're like, wow, there might be, there's almost surely vast structure all around us all the time,
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of events that are happening that are not relevant to our survival.
Right.
And, some of it we can't even detect, right?
Right.
But some of it, even if we can detect it, is not relevant to our survival.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so, what evolution finds, an adequate solution, and then
Mm-hmm.
if the animal can have babies, that gets kind of passed on. That doesn't mean that it's a perfect solution. I mean,
Right.
um, yeah, but what was the word you used? Realistic,
It's indirect realism.
indirect
Yeah.
realism. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
Okay.
so I agree with Kant in the sense that we're not representing things in themselves. I don't even see how we could,
Mm-hmm.
um, but we're experiencing is
Right.
in this. I mean, you call it a hallucination or a construction,
Mm-hmm.
but it's evolved to be incredibly good for the purposes of any given animal.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So Peter, in your physicalist view, what do you speculate is being represented, or what is outside? There's some people that talk about the universe as mathematical, and that it's all interpretation of
Uh,
mathematics. What is your, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pythagoras was the first to say that. You know, first of all, I think there's no way of truly knowing
No.
outside of our modes of knowing,
Mm.
but it wouldn't surprise me at all if the underlying reality is actually nothing,
Mm.
namely the vacuum,
Huh.
and that what we regard as, an event, like well, a thing, like an electron or, a cup, is actually ultimately a sort of almost standing wave in a sea of virtual particles.
Mm.
But that's just a very highly metaphysical guess,
Mm.
and I
Yeah.
don't know how I would prove that, but
So by nothing, you mean it in the Eastern sense as opposed to the Western. Like
well,
no thingness. It's not a thing, but it's a
uh,
potential, perhaps, or a sea of possibilities, or
yeah, I mean, I think that, if you, so I started out in quantum mechanics and
yeah.
theory, and I was always, it's just such a crazy set of, I mean, it's an incredible theory, and it predicts so well, and yet what it seems to say about reality is just so strange,
Mm.
where possibilities seem to interact, like in the Feynman, representation of the double slit experiment, where uh, causation seems to be very non-local,
Mm.
and there's well, non-locality, so it's very strange. But one key concept in quantum mechanics is the idea of the quantization of action. Now, action is not energy. It has the units of either energy time, so you can think of it as changing energy,
Mm.
or momentum position. You can think of it as sort of like, I don't know, change over space. And that seems to come in its smallest unit, given by Planck's constant. It's incredibly tiny,
Mm.
but, the equation is delta E energy, delta T time or duration has to be greater than or equal to the Planck's constant, or H, whatever it is, H bar over 2.
Mm.
Um, well, what does that imply? It implies that, virtual particle pairs can come into existence and go out of existence as long as they're shorter than Planck's constant.
Mm.
So if that is true, then the underlying vacuum is not a thing for sure.
Mm.
But it's not dead and it's not passive.
Mm.
It's a seething sea of virtual particles that are coming into and going out of existence. Um,
So wouldn't you say that that's more mental than physical? Or is that where you sort
I,
of define physical differently? And
I don't know. I mean, this most underlying layer of reality, I don't, probably words like mental and physical
don't
simply don't
apply. So
apply.
maybe neutral monism, something like what Russell suggested, or Mach.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't feel a need to give it a name. I mean,
Okay,
and I mean, there was,
you know what I'm
in
referring
fact,
to, though, right? Yeah, yeah.
yeah, there is this really cool recent experiment. I forget who did it. It's in my book, in the section, in the neurophilosophy book, in the section where I talk about why I am an indeterminist. But they hung a, okay, so everyone has heard of Brownian motion, right?
Mm.
So, if you put a piece of pollen in water, it seems to jiggle around. And Einstein showed in 1905 that that is almost surely because of atoms hitting it, but we can't see the atoms, so the pollen is moving around.
Mm.
Um, And, Einstein was committed to determinism. And so he said, well, it looks random, but in fact, ultimately it's deterministic. Now, there was recently an experiment in which they hung a really heavy object, like let's say 10 kilograms or something, and they hung it in a perfect vacuum, or as perfect as humans can make it.
Mm.
And they showed that it jiggled around.
Oh.
And the argument there is that it's being buffeted by virtual particles. Now, this is very much like the idea of the Lucretian swerve. I mean, there's an underlying buffeting due to the underlying nature of the vacuum.
Mm.
So if and in the book, I talk about lots of other examples where
Yeah.
virtual particles exert physical consequences among actual particles
Hmm.
or objects.
Yeah.
So, one strategy would be to say, well, in fact, there's only virtual particles, but some virtual particles seem to take on this sort of pseudo long lasting life, like a standing wave or something. Like this is getting beyond my knowledge or
Mm.
maybe anybody's, but getting back to your original question, I think was, what is the underlying nature of real reality? Given that we have no way to access real reality except through our senses, it's the Kantian problem of
Hmm.
the phenomenal and the noumenal. We
Yeah.
don't have access to the noumenal, but the noumenal is almost surely way stranger than we think.
Hmm.
I mean, I think quantum non-locality is just mind-blowingly strange.
Right.
That an event, like some seemingly random fluctuation inside the star, whatever, Centaurus,
Right.
might be correlated instantaneously with some fluctuation in me right now,
Right. Yeah.
So
That's
the universe is surely much stranger than our models of the universe.
talking about strange, and to bring us back to more comfortable zone, perhaps. Are you familiar with Mike Levin's work?
Is he the planaria guy?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
I think he's like at Boston College or something,
um,
or
Tufts. He's at
Tufts.
Tufts. He's
Tufts,
at
yeah.
Tufts. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I don't know him personally, but it's pretty cool.
yeah. So I was wondering about that because, and I don't know if your views changed on this, but you argued that most of things that are non-biological in nature are non-conscious because they don't decode inputs, right? That are based on the informational criteria. Um, Now, I thought it was interesting because in Mike Levin's work, he showed that non-neural systems, right, can use bioelectric signaling to solve problems and maintain homeostasis and coordinate morphogenesis. Um, I guess, do these findings suggest to you at all or alter your views at all in regards to the potential for proto consciousness or intelligence outside of neural systems?
Well, I mean, for sure, there seems to be great intelligence in systems that have no neurons, like
Right.
plants.
Yeah.
But, if you ever watch an amoeba
Yeah.
or a protozoan, they don't have neurons and they are doing incredibly complex processing. Um, and they seem to have some kind of intelligence, even sentience, if you watch a protozoan. So, you know, um, ti getting back to Levin's, so I'm not an expert in Levin's work,
But
but
even these
but
examples that you've brought up, right, and in these non-neural systems having complex decision-making capacity,
yeah,
I guess how does the decoding fit there, or is there no decoder in your mind in those situations?
well, I would think that. So I don't know how it works in an amoeba
Hmm.
or protozoan or even a plant, but there has to be some kind of decoding of inputs in order to respond to those inputs, just logically. So, for example, a plant um, responds to light and it tends to bend towards the light, right?
Right, right, yeah.
So there have to be some mechanisms whereby that happens. Now, it's probably not at the level of a proposition like a sunflower saying, well, the sun's over there, I'm going to turn my head toward the sun. It's
Mm.
probably happening at a more, uh, I would think, probably non-conscious mechanistic level. Like there's probably, I don't know what they would be called, phyto something
Mm.
sensors at a chemical level that then lead to changes in growth.
Hmm.
Um, Now, does a sunflower have any conscious experience? I don't know. I mean, I don't know how I would find that out.
Right.
Um, it's if it does, it's going to be radically different than ours, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what's the point of having vision if you can't do anything about it, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I think I was talking to Dan Dennett, may he rest in peace, and
Yeah.
he was saying,
Yeah.
well, what's the point of trees having, eyes, right? Oh, there's somebody coming at me with a chainsaw. Well, I better do nothing. I can't do anything, right? So, um, I don't actually know how you would settle whether an amoeba or a tree has consciousness
Okay.
of any form, any kind of subjective experience.
Yeah.
I myself am more interested, in what I think is an answerable question,
Okay.
which is what beings can carry out mental operations that I can only carry out over conscious operands. So, for example, volitional attentional tracking is something that people can only do if they're conscious of. So let's say there's 10 seagulls flying around, and I'll say, okay, look at my nose, but I want you to attentionally put your attentional tractor beam on that seagull,
Mm.
and they're all flying around. And then I say, okay, which one was it? And you'll be like, oh, it was that one. And you'll be right? Because you have this internal ability to attentionally track. That you can only do if you're conscious. We've done experiments where we put into the eyes what's called continuous flash suppression.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you experience. And in this eye, we put just two things, and they're rotating incredibly slowly. So first, we said we never published this because it was a null result, but we should have published it. Um, you know, Pay attention to the one in the upper left, and people would say, "I don't see anything. I just see a bunch of flashing lights," and then they would move. And at the end of it, it would go 90 degrees this way or this way. And we say, "Which one was it?" And they say, "I don't see anything," and just guess, because then they would both turn off, and there'd be two dots. Which one was the one that you tracked from here to here or here to here? Total chance.
Hmm.
Right. So people cannot do volitional attentional tracking if they're not conscious of that which they are volitionally
Yeah.
attentionally tracking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I can create an experiment that shows that an octopus, for example, can do that. Imagine an experiment where you're an octopus and there's two rocks,
Mm-hmm.
virtual rocks, and now it's hungry because I haven't fed it for a day. And now a virtual crab comes out from behind, but now there are two rocks again. Now if I move those rocks toward the octopus, or like this, or maybe crossing,
Mm-hmm.
and then I open the cage door underwater, and the octopus goes to the rock that presumably has the crab behind it, that would be evidence of attentional tracking.
Mm-hmm.
That would be evidence for me in support of the idea that they have mental operations tracking
Mm-hmm.
that I can only do if I'm conscious. So that's indirect evidence that they're conscious. Now, is it proof? No, because I can create a MATLAB script that would also be able to do tracking.
Right.
Do I think a MATLAB script is conscious? No, but it might be as good as we can get.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
for plants
Yeah.
or an amoeba, I really, I don't know how. Somebody
Mm-hmm.
might think of some really cool thing, but I don't know. And then there's other questions of where is information stored. Like I think that people like Levin and Randy Gallistel, uh, David Glannon, I think it is, they asked the question of what the engram is. So a lot of this planario work was started out. I forget his name, John McCulloch or McClellan or something, back in I think the 60s or 70s, and he would teach a planaria
Mm-hmm.
like with classical conditioning to go toward a light or away from a light, and then he cut the planaria in half, and then the head part could still do it, but the tail couldn't. But then, after 2 weeks, the tail would grow a head, and then it could do it.
Right.
Okay, where was the information stored?
Mm-hmm.
In the tail. And then he did even crazier stuff where he ground up, put a planaria into a blender and then fed it to another planaria, and
Mm-hmm.
it could then do it at above chance. That's really strange stuff. And it's suggestive of the idea that there might be information stored in a non-neuronal format, right?
Yeah.
Because
Mm-hmm.
if I put a planaria in a blender, I've ground up all of its neurons, right? So I'm totally open to that. Life was around for billions of years before neurons came along.
Right.
And so there have to be modes of information processing, maybe even sentience, that are present in non-neuronal systems, like an amoeba or a protozoan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Perhaps a subtle difference is in the definition of intelligence and consciousness, and perhaps things can be intelligent yet not conscious, or something like that. But going back to some other stuff, and then we'll start tying things up. But I am interested in free will as it evolved through evolution. And I think one of the more convincing arguments that I heard, I think it was from Mark Solms, maybe from my talk with him actually, but the idea here is that that free will potentially evolved to control for chance and unpredictability. That if we were simply automatized the entire way and it was stimulus reaction as opposed to stimulus space response, then we would just be basically perseverating and making the same mistake over and over, versus the fact that we can actually, pause and make a particular decision amongst a bunch of competing responses. What are your thoughts on that, and do you have more to add to that?
Well, even at the level of a bacterium, if it's predictable, a predator will simply go to where it's going and then eat it,
Mm,
right? So unpredictability is of great value to any prey species.
mm,
Now, is that volitional? No. I mean, in the case of a bacterium, it has this little rotor, and it has a flagellum, and if it rotates one way, it goes forward. If it rotates the other way, it tumbles to a new direction. So, but I do think, the harnessing of randomness is of great value, not only at that level, but even at the level of organisms, right?
mm,
To inject some randomness into the system for the generation of novelty or unexpected results, and that might play some role in um, creativity. Um, but free will, I think, is operating not primarily at the level of randomness. It's again operating at this level of deliberation. I mean, going back to David Hume, he said, "Well, there's nothing betwixt utter determinism, in which you have no say in the matter
mm,
of what shall happen, or utter randomness, in which case you have no say in the case of what will happen." And I've argued that criterial causation or pattern causation or phase causation is this sort of middle ground where you can set the constraints or parameters of what will count as a solution. And so randomness does play a role, but it's not totally random, right? So I
mm,
could say to you, for example, think of a politician. Poof, you might have thought of somebody, Donald Trump. I say, oh, actually, think of a woman politician. Poof, you might have thought of Hillary Clinton. I say, well, actually, think of a European woman politician. And I say, ooh, I don't know, Victoria May. Okay. No, actually, I want you to think of a red-haired European woman politician.
mm,
Now, why did you think of Angela Merkel versus, say, Margaret Thatcher? Well, that might have been chance, but it's not utter chance
mm,
because it had to happen within those very narrow constraints. And sometimes constraints are so narrow that there's only one solution. Like, what's your mother's maiden name? Right? There's
mm,
only one solution. Um, but I do think we are harnessing randomness in our deliberations. We set constraints within our imagination.
mm,
Um, but this, free will is really in this domain of the imagination, I think. And I often give the beautiful example of, Jane Goodall, who was not she was from a working class family in London in the 1930s or 40s. Her father was a soldier. Her mother, I think, cleaned houses. And she had it in her head, she finished high school. She didn't go to college. She's working as a secretary somewhere, that she wants to go to Africa. And people are like, what are you, crazy? You should find a nice bloke and have babies like other normal women. And she said, I don't want to be a normal woman, right? So her mother finally says, okay, Jane, look, if this is really what you want, I'm going to clean extra houses and buy you a one-way ticket to Mombasa, which she does. And then Jane makes her way to Nairobi, right? And she gets a job as a secretary at the Museum of Natural History, where eventually Louis Leakey, the great paleoanthropologist, sees her. Now he's surrounded by all these wannabe Louis Leakeys, right? You know how men are. They're like, they want to be the next Louis Leakey. He's looking for someone who might live with chimpanzees, who
mm,
would be very quiet and very observant. So he kind of tests her. He says, well, you spend, let's say a year out at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania with me sorting fossils. And she's, of course. And eventually he says to her, Miss Goodall, can you imagine living with chimpanzees? And she goes, you know what? That's why I'm here, right? So she created her own luck. I mean, a lot of life is creating your own luck.
mm,
It's, opportunism in the good sense of
mm,
you don't know how it's going to happen, but if you want to be an actor, you got to go to New York or L.A. You're not going to, you don't go to, you know, some podunk place in the middle of,
mm.
Iowa, right? You
Right.
go to where the action is.
Right.
And so that's a good example of
Mm.
distal free will,
Mm.
where we create the conditions that will afford that which we only imagined
Mm.
to become real.
Right. It brings me to mind I think it was a paraphrase, of course, of William James, where he said that consciousness is that which loads the die.
Yeah, I
Right.
like that. But I mean, it's either a related saying would be Karl Popper,
Mm.
who said, consciousness, I would say consciousness in the form of the virtual reality consciousness,
Right.
playing things out, what you study with the default mode network.
Mm.
Consciousness evolved so our hypotheses can die in our stead.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good.
Another thing we haven't really touched upon here is in addition to criteriality of
Mm.
processing, it's highly cybernetic,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's these negative feedback loops, so that we can have a goal in mind and we can get knocked down, but we just, it's like that song, I get knocked down, but I get up again.
Right.
So a good example would be orangutans in Borneo. They like durian, right? This is smelly
The
fruit.
smelly fruit. Yeah.
They will, they'll walk through the jungle for like 2 weeks to get to trees that they know will bloom in 2 weeks. I mean, be ripe in 2 weeks. So they have to have a very elaborate cognitive map. Now, along the way, they might stumble or be attacked by something, and then they defend that off. But then they get back on track. And this kind of getting back on track is the essence of cybernetics. So, for example, there's boring kinds of cybernetics like a thermostat, right? If it gets too hot, the furnace turns off. Gets too cold, the furnace turns on, right? And that set point is set by an external person.
Mm-hmm.
But evolution has given us set points that are internal, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm thirsty. Hydration. So I experience that consciously as a deviation from the needed hydration. I'm thirsty. I go look for water. Then I drink water, and then the thought of drinking more water is repulsive to me, right? So I'm constantly going around my perfect hydration point. Now, some of the goals that we set are not set by evolution, like I want to get a PhD, right? Or in the case of the orangutan, I want to get to the ripe fruit
Mm-hmm.
in 2 weeks. Well, in the case of a PhD, right, you probably all of us who went through a PhD process, it's a path of endless suffering, right? And you get knocked down, but you get up again, right? Like your experiments fail, you have no results, nothing works. You realize you collect tons of data, and then you realize there was a bug in your program, and
Mm-hmm.
you've wasted, a year of your life. Well, you start over and you get back on track because you have this internally generated set point of I want to go to Africa, I want to get a PhD, I want to get to the durian. And we're able to again and again error correct. Now, just as with criterial causation, there's many ways um, to realize any given criteria, right? Think of a woman. Poof, you thought of some woman. Well, it's not random, right? Because it was a woman, but it's random within the constraint that it was a woman. Cybernetics and related ideas like autopoiesis are all about feedback such that a system is able to um, reach its goals.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those goals are, transcendent goals. Like I want to become a more spiritual person.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these goals are more practical. Like I want to get to the durian. Um, and I think what criterial causation and cybernetics uh, have in common is that there's just many ways to skin a cat.
Mm-hmm.
My goal is to skin the cat. I can do it lots of different ways. And some of the cybernetic processes are not conscious, right? So if I shove you, you will automatically correct. Now, your first step will be quite rough. Then the next, but you're detecting an error relative to your set point, which is to remain vertical.
Mm-hmm.
I knock you off, and then you correct.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of cybernetic process can be entirely unconscious. That doesn't mean that all cybernetic processes are unconscious. In fact, evolution, and I think this is a key insight of what's his name? His argument, I'm forgetting his name, is that consciousness actually first evolved for this kind of cybernetic process, not for seeing distant goals. You know, the first thing to evolve that became consciousness was the sense that I need more salt. I
Hmm.
need more, so the desires were the first conscious things. Um, uh, Derek Denton, I think is his name.
Huh.
And that's entirely plausible to me, right? So, the contents of consciousness are not only a world, probably more fundamentally, there are desires and emotions that are evaluating the world, but even evaluating states of my body. Like
Hmm.
there's tissue damage, pain,
Right.
there's a need for water, there's a need for food, there's a need for salt.
Hmm.
And those things are very also intrinsically uh, realized in consciousness, but they're not about the world. They're about a need of the body.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Excellent. Well, we're closing in on a 2 hour mark here.
Oh wow. Okay.
Well, it's excellent. We've had so much great information and wonderful to hear all this stuff. Let me just ask you this final question, even though I have a few more actually. But ask this final question, and then actually we do for my podcast we have this tradition of rapid fire questions at the end, and I hope you'll be okay with that. But my final question is just really more so about what you're doing right now. What projects are you working on now? What are you anticipating to do in the future? What's happening?
Right now, I'm in a collaboration with someone I went to grad school with, Frank Tong. He's at Vanderbilt, and
Hmm.
we're trying to understand the neural basis of an intention.
Ah.
So it turns out that if you have a apparent motion that's two dots here and then two dots here, you can either see it as whoop vertical or whoop horizontal,
Hmm.
and you can will to see it going that way or that way.
Right.
So volitional control of your subsequent perception is all around us. But it's super interesting, right? So a lot of people are zooming in on um, attention, but and I have it as well. I've spent 30 years looking at attention, but
Mm.
actually intention is also very interesting, right? So if I close my eyes and I think, okay, when I open my eyes, I want to see the clouds as animals or as faces or as whatever. Um, I can, and I open my eyes and poof, wow, that cloud looks like a bear or a dragon,
Mm.
you know. Um, how does that work? So that's something we're working on now.
Interesting. It kind of brings
And
up the idea of instead of seeing as believing, believing as seeing, or
yeah, yeah, the causation is working both ways, right?
right, right.
Um, yeah.
Okay. All right. So you open to these rapid fire questions? I guess you don't.
Okay, well, it depends how personal they get, but okay, I'll give it a
Okay.
shot.
Feel free to say pass if it's too personal. All right. Name up to three books that you love.
The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, um, Blueprint by Nicholas Christakis, um, and any of John Steinbeck's novels.
Okay. Name up to three philosophers that deeply inspired you.
Oh, for sure, Jaegwon Kim.
Hmm.
He really helped me because his exclusion argument was very deeply disturbing to me.
Right.
But anyway, I went down to Brown to see him, and he's like, he basically said, because he was probably in his 70s when I met him, 60s. He basically was saying, you need to relax. And he really impressed me because he said, yes, the exclusion argument implies that all causation seeps down to the bottommost level of strings where uh, concepts like morality don't even apply. And certainly consciousness don't apply. But he said, I must be wrong because I can't account for the phenomenality of redness or any other qualia.
Hmm.
That was very impressive to me. Um,
His humility.
yeah, yeah, he that really impressed me. So three, I mean, Kant for sure. Al Mili and Eddie Namias were great people to talk to. Adina Roski's, Walter Sonata Armstrong were people I interacted with a lot.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I can go on, but yeah,
Okay.
I just think philosophers are really great because they're zooming in on a very important form of truth, which is logical coherence.
Hmm.
And we in science are looking for
Correspondence.
correspondence
Right.
truth. And you need both, right? So people like Libet or Wegner or Sapolsky or Harris, people who have legitimacy because they're in science, then they go into philosophy and make these really kind of simplistic logical mistakes. It's like, ugh, it's cringe.
Mm.
So I think what we really need is a PhD program that's neurophilosophy. Get
Yeah,
hardcore
agree with
science and hardcore philosophy training. I mean, anybody wants to hire me for that, let me know. um, yeah.
Do you know
Anyway,
George Northoff or his work?
I well, I've interacted with him. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Georg. Yeah, he's German.
Yeah,
He's in Toronto or
he's in
somewhere.
Ottawa. He's in Ottawa.
Ottawa. Yeah, I was just at a conference with him in Spain. Yeah, he's pretty out there. He's a good
Yeah,
guy.
he's an interesting guy. He's also, PhD philosophy as well as
Yeah, 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 yeah,
neuroscientist. We have
yeah.
publications together, but he helped me out actually with my study because I was looking at self-referential processing. Um,
Well, yeah.
but
No, we need more such people, right? Because scientists alone cannot find the truth, but philosophers alone cannot find the truth, right? You need both hardcore logical coherence and hardcore correspondence with reality.
mhm.
And it depends on the problem, right? I mean, if your problem is to figure out the coastline of North America, logic plays no role in that.
Right.
I
Hmm.
mean, maybe it does, but I mean, mostly you just have to go look.
Hmm. Hmm.
But if your goal is to, anyway, I mean,
Well,
both
maybe
have
you
to be
can
true.
start a program, Peter, at Dartmouth.
I don't know. I'm chair now. I'm just very much looking forward to stepping down, and then next year I'm going to spend a year at Cambridge University on sabbatical. So
Oh,
I'll be in
that'll be
England.
nice.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Okay. What did you want to be when you were growing up?
Oh, I wanted to be. I had the best mother in the world. I mean, we grew up in a very kind of poor part of Manhattan called Washington Heights, which at the time was, mostly Puerto Rican, but some old Jews, but mostly Puerto Rican. And at that time in this, 60s and 70s, museums were free in New York. They didn't ask. So I basically grew up in the Museum of Natural History. I wanted to be some kind of scientist that would, like an archaeologist was really appealing to me.
Hmm.
But art was also appealing to me. I don't know. I was a kid, and then
Hmm.
later in life, probably because my Chinese father was putting pressure on me, I wanted to go into mathematics and physics.
Mm.
But then I actually became kind of not disillusioned with it, but I had this advisor who he said, you need to just because I was at Dartmouth undergrad, and he's like, you don't need to study more physics for now. Just go do stuff. And so I went to the Peace Corps and lived in Nepal for a couple of years. And um, I guess I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up until quite late. You
Mm.
know,
Hmm.
I spent. I mean, in Nepal, I read endless philosophy. I was training myself, and for a while, I thought maybe I want to become a philosopher, and then. Um, But then the allure of making money in Japan was too big. And my brother was he was a kind of a karate fanatic and was
Mm.
studying karate. And he's like, this is the late '80s. He said you can make like $200 an hour here, which was impossibly much money back
Yeah,
in the '80s.
that.
So I went there and I ended up spending about 4.5 years there. And it was only after the stock market crashed around the time 1990 91 that I realized, what, I got to get out of here. Um, and I had made a little bit of money, essentially working as a businessman.
Hmm.
And it's only then, kind of at the age of 28, 29, that I was like, you know what? I want to go back into science. I really love science. I miss science. And then I thought, it's kind of late to make a mark in math or physics
Mm.
at 28, 29. And the greatest mystery, or sort of the second greatest mystery in the universe is, consciousness. How
Hmm.
can you study that? So I went and studied psychology with Patrick Kavanagh and Ken Akiyama. But the first greatest mystery is why there's something versus nothing, right?
Mm. Hmm.
And I don't know if anybody has a good answer to that. And anytime anybody says they have the answer to that, get a question.
Yeah, the skeptical hat comes on.
Yeah.
Are you on the side of moral intuitionism or morality as a social construction?
I think that we are not a tabula rasa. I think we have innate genetically given propensities,
Hmm.
but how they are realized is shaped by the environment, our own decisions, but especially culture.
Hmm.
So everybody has probably seen these cool experiments with the monkeys who get envious by what's his name, Frans de Waal.
Mm, yeah.
So if you go to YouTube and type in, monkey experiments, Frans de Waal, but it's, basically, if you give a monkey a rock and it gives it back, you give it a cucumber, it's happy. But if there's two monkeys and that monkey does the rock task and gets a grape, but you only get a cucumber, the monkey gets furious, right? It is jealous, envious, and it wants, it shakes the cage. And then, in the very funny TED Talk video by Frans de Waal, the monkey throws the rock at the experimenter. So, we would say in the case of a monkey that that kind of envy at unequal payoffs for equal work
Yeah.
is probably genetically given, right?
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that's certainly true of us. Now, but we are not uh, as genetically probably limited by instinct as a monkey is.
Hmm.
So I really love the work of another philosopher, is Peter Singer. I mean, he's done a lot of stuff, but he has this one cool book called The Expanding Circle, in which he makes the argument that our nervous system has sort of innate parameters, but how those parameters are set depends on many factors,
Yeah.
such as the environment, such as culture, such as our own decisions.
Hmm.
He gives the example, for example, of in-group versus out-group. Like there seems to be an innate, almost sort of pseudo-tribalistic tendency to link with an in-group.
Hmm.
But he points out that in some cultures that's defined incredibly narrowly, like in say Papua New Guinea highlands of 200 years ago, you could um, it was defined as those people in your valley who spoke your language, and those things that look like people, they weren't, and you could actually eat them, right?
Hmm.
As opposed to say uh, some Buddhist or Jains who regard all sentient beings as part of their in-group, and therefore, like Jains go through life sweeping the sidewalk so they don't step on any bugs. So there's an innate parameter, namely in-groupness, but it can be defined very narrowly
Hmm.
or very broadly. And so his point is expanding the circle. How can we define things more broadly
Hmm.
such that, and, we give consideration to, say, chimpanzees and gorillas that we would to people?
Right.
Or in the case of, the animal rights movement,
Hmm.
that we give animals, a right to live simply because they're sentient
Hmm.
and conscious and feel pain, in which case he would advocate, I suppose, vegetarianism.
Hmm. I think it's
So,
interesting.
yeah,
Sorry, just wanted to say, I don't know what you think about Yak Panksepp's work.
I
Uh,
don't know it.
oh, you don't know? Oh, interesting. It's Affective Neuroscience is his big textbook, but one of the big things that he talks about is are seven primary emotions that he identifies, but also the idea that consciousness may actually begin at the brainstem, or at least be related to it. And we don't have to get into a big discussion of that now. But the idea there would that's an idea of a concept that could expand the conceptual borders, perhaps, of how we relate to other animals and other beings. Um, the other part, though, I think of our is meditation, really, and Eastern traditions, the ability to suppress areas of the default mode network, like the posterior cingulate cortex, right, and feelings of oneness when people experience either on psilocybin or if they're having a mystical experience of some sort or experiencing awe or another self-transcendent experience in relationship to the environment or whatnot. All those sorts of things are different, I think, ways that could contribute that to that border. But it sounds like tell me if I'm wrong, that you're saying that people are born with a particular moral disposition, and to potentiate those dispositions is the necessity for particular experiences, and those experiences will either help them flourish or reduce the parameters in which they can be experienced.
Well, so humans are born with propensities or proclivities.
Hmm.
There are parameters which can be set. And this ties in with your clinical work. A lot of this happens before the age of 5, probably even before the age of 3. What is the world in which I exist, and how do I adapt myself to that world? Am I safe? Am I loved? Or am I not? And you internalize that into your operating system, essentially. So I would say very central to the cultivation of a moral life and a spiritual life is the scaffolding you received before the age of 3. And if we really want to change the world, we have to really focus on preschool and parenting. Um, but, like if I have a building, uh, you need scaffolding to build a building. And once you take the scaffolding away, it's like it never existed, but it was necessary at the time. Culture plays the role of scaffolding in building a brain and a mind. And if you don't have any scaffolding, like these feral kids raised by
Yeah.
animals, you wouldn't expect much moral behavior from such a person, right? So our moral behavior, our ability to judge right from wrong, and to care about what is deemed good is cultivated in us, not only by our own efforts, but by the efforts of all the people who raise us, rabbis, priests, coaches, parents, all of that, siblings. And if we want to change the world, we should not only look at the individual level, but at the community level, because it's so key for the development of individuals.
There's a recent push for more hunter-gatherer style parenting, and the thought that because we spent 95 to 99% of our histories as hunter-gatherers, and that technology and the civilization is so different that perhaps it's uh, atypical for us to be developing the way that we are, and that it should be more closely related to how hunter-gatherers raise their children in communities and co-sleeping and all that sort of stuff. What are your thoughts on that
Well,
as a parent?
well, that's interesting. I mean, I haven't thought about that, but I think that, we are born not with a single parameter, but there's lots and lots of parameters that have to be set. Some concern, going back to the monkey example, issues of envy. What should trigger envy? Um, some concern what counts as an in-group. Some, and you know, the one set of propensities, and this is what my friend Nicholas Christakis talks about in his book Blueprint, is that we have an innate propensity to be good and empathic or empathetic and good to each other, cooperative. But we also have other tendencies
Yeah.
that are selfish and which shall be fostered. Which if we want to create people who are more empathic, more cooperative, kinder, what kind of social system would we want to have, right? Um, so really, if you want to get into issues of neuroscience or spirituality, we have to get into issues of economics. What kind of social system or economic system do we want to create such that it will bring out the best in people? Now, I think pretty clearly the existing social system is failing
Yeah.
because it's triggering endless envy, right? And it's, a lot of what drove Trump's support was the fact that it was economic, right? It was the middle classes getting the shaft by globalization. All those working class jobs went to China or elsewhere. A lot of things became outsourced. There's no jobs, no hope, no money. Um, and so, no kidding, people vote for. In fact, I asked my German grandfather, because I'm half Chinese and half German. I asked my German grandfather, whether he had voted for Hitler in 1933, and he said, "Well, you didn't vote for Hitler, you voted for the party, but yes." And he was like, "Why?" Because he was going to make Germany great again, And I think that the desperation that came out of the Weimar inflation and the sort of the massive uh, loss of meaning and purpose and
Yeah.
dislocation that arose with the depression, that's what gave rise to Hitler. So how do we create a social system that will bring out purposiveness, meaningfulness, love, kindness, depth in human beings, as opposed to envy, meanness, jealousy, possessiveness? We have the potential for both of those,
Right.
but we ourselves are not the sole determinants of how we become. A lot of it happens before the age of 3, and we adapt to the world in which we find ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean we're slaves to the world in which we find ourselves. We can see the patterns in ourselves, we can see the patterns in the world, and we can fight to change it. I mean, the abolitionists, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, triggered ultimately a civil war. And we don't have slavery anymore, at least in this country to that extent. 100 odd years ago, women didn't have the vote. And that seems unthinkable now, right?
Yeah.
So that's just 2 lifetimes in duration ago that we had. I could have owned a slave or been a slave, right, in 1860.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
what is obvious now that might become unthinkable in 200 years or 500 years, right? So a lot of things can be changed, right? Just because there's always been slavery, and just because women have always been oppressed doesn't mean that they always have to be. And we have evidence that the world has changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have some say in the matter of not only how we shall become, but also how the world shall become.
Mm.
And that all starts with a vision. And then the question is, what's the vision? And that's, in the domain of imagination. We have to imagine what's possible
Right.
because we can change it.
Well said, Peter. That was very motivational and inspirational. That's a good
Okay.
piece. I will say, though, that our rapid fire questions are turning into a lot longer of a conversation.
Sorry, my kids tell me I could talk too much. I know.
Well, no, perhaps we could have another conversation if you're open to it in
Oh,
the future.
happily.
Um,
Yeah.
so let me just ask you four more last
Oh,
questions.
4 more. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
quick ones though, quick ones. So, what type of music do you like?
Uh, Acoustic, typically. I play the guitar. I can. I enjoy singing. All kinds of classical music. I love all kinds of anything I can dance to. Yeah, and but there's been so much great music.
Right.
And I'm always amazed when I discover a new type of music. No, for me, music is really one of the great joys of life.
Wonderful. Share something about yourself that not a lot of people know.
Hmm. I mean, I was going to say I have an octopus lab, but that's not that
Oh,
interesting.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
I I love learning languages. I love nature. I I don't know.
Okay, that's fine.
It's kind of hard. Kind of hard to answer that. I don't think I'm an extremely unusual person.
Hmm.
Um, I love traveling. I love, you know, I don't know, just being with real people,
Hmm.
having, hanging out,
Hmm.
which seems very hunter-gatherer like.
Well, that's
I think we have to rediscover the fine art of hanging out. I the way I grew up in the 60s and 70s, that's all you could do, right? You only knew like 10 people
mm,
in this analog world, and you kind of hung out maybe in front of the 7-Eleven and smoked your first pot with that one, and then you dated that one, and you got a punch in the face from that one, but people knew you really well.
hmm
And I think that is very valuable, and we've kind of lost that. But there's sort of this distinction between who you are as a person and your persona.
yeah.
And I think with all the social media, people they're living more and more in their persona,
Hmm.
and they're viewing their own life as content, which they will post,
Right.
or and a lot of it's just fake. And like I was on Facebook for a while initially, and I was like, wow, this is great. I'm meeting all these old friends, but then I realized that it's kind of like fake book because people are like, oh, here I am on Tortola with my shrimp cocktail, and I was, it's all presentation, right?
Hmm.
But you cannot fall in love as a persona to a persona. You fall in love as a person to a person. So I think there has to be a rediscovery of personhood,
Yeah.
and that happens in the context, in the crucible of deep friendship, deep love,
Hmm.
of people who know you really well as a person, flaws and all.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's
so I don't know.
it's interesting reading older authors. I was reading Eric Fromm a while ago, and I mean he talks a lot still about, and it's still applicable today, where so many relationships are just so transactional,
Yeah,
as opposed to having that I vow relationship or a real connection that's genuine. It's
That's what it's all about. Like The Art of Loving is another book everybody
yeah,
should read.
I love that book also. I recommend it to people with relationship challenges.
Yeah, and also another book along those lines would be Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor
Viktor
Frankl.
Frankl. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I think, in your, I hadn't thought about this, but, rediscovering the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, I think a lot of that has to be hanging out. I
Mm,
actually know somebody who lived with the San people. These are the Click language people of Botswana.
right.
He lived with them for a few years, and I talked to him about what it was like, and he said, yeah, mostly they're just hanging out. They probably spend, 4 hours a day hunting or gathering
Mm,
on average, but mostly they're just hanging out around the fire,
hmm
talking, a lot of group therapy.
hmm
Um,
A lot of
so
group
I think we have to
therapy. That's
we
good.
have to rediscover that. We have to rediscover
Yeah.
that. It's been lost in the. I mean, I'm old enough now to see the whole thing having played out. In my childhood, where there were no computers, there was no
Hmm
laptops, there was no internet, no phones, no. But people were happier. You knew, Vinny the fish guy and Luigi the pizza guy, and you knew like the whole. And this revolution, and now we're in the second part. I mean, digitalization, computerization, and now AI. You know, these are revolutions in terms of information processing, and they facilitate many amazing things like this. This is amazing. But ultimately, what's really the wealth of life is physical health, emotional health,
hmm
love, real friendships, real family, touch. None of that is digital, right?
Right.
So I would say, what makes you asked me, something about me. I'm in love with the analog.
Mm,
The thing is that the trick is, right, like we can't go back to being
no.
Hadza people in, Tanzania hunting every day, right? But how do you return to the essence of that, which is the analog nature of life
Right.
and connection as the foundation of life,
Hmm
as opposed to living
hmm
on screens, through screens, viewing your own life not as life, but as content for presentation to others. How to not be a persona, how to be a person.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um,
Yeah.
okay. Do you believe in a higher power?
Not in an anthropomorphic sense,
Mm.
but for me, God would be nature itself. If we had to use the word God,
So you're a
um,
pantheist, would you say?
I wouldn't say I'm a theist at
Or
all. Pantheist or monotheist.
pantheism, the
I
nature of
mean,
God kind of sort of idea.
I think we have to make a distinction between our models of reality and then reality.
Mm.
And I'm very interested in experiencing reality and ultimately, also understanding reality. But I also am, humble enough to realize that there's just no hope that I will understand reality. I mean, first of all, why something exists versus nothing.
Mm.
I don't think anybody has a good answer to that. Um, and some things might simply be beyond our ability to even think, like what preceded the beginning or what caused the beginning,
Mm.
what lies outside of everything. Those are actually oxymoronic, right? They're you know believe that there's a higher guiding person who cares about me. No,
Mm.
when I drive down the highway, I see squished animals on the highway. I think that reality can be very brutal. That doesn't mean, though, that life is meaningless, right? So, relative to the exploding vacuum, nothing has any meaning. But relative to me, my children have enormous meaning.
Mm.
Relative to me, if I'm hungry, food has value.
Mm.
So relative to me, uh, life has value. If I were to create or play some role in the creation of a new framework for guiding human life, I would say life is sacred
Mm.
and we are part of life. The earth is sacred.
Mm.
So I think a kind of biocentric view of ethics and spirituality is a guiding principle for me. Now, whether there's life on other planets or whether there's some kind of underlying propensity in matter itself to become living, I don't know.
Mm.
Um,
Well, you guessed my
but
last
clear,
questions.
but clearly, reality is bizarre enough that it gave rise to you and me, right?
Mhm.
Like we're pretty bizarre that we exist at all, and even with our nature, this came out of physics, right?
Mm,
And getting back to criterial causation, I think part of it was the discovery of basing causation upon patterns of, as shape, timing, and so forth,
mm,
as opposed to simply mass and inertia and momentum and so forth.
mm,
And that life really ran with that, causation by pattern recognition and the releasing of responses
mm,
when patterns are realized or recognized.
mm.
Yeah. Anyway, what's your last question?
Good. Well, actually, you already sort of
Oh, okay.
answered my questions in your own thoughts. But one thing to end this, I was curious to hear your thoughts on this. That when someone says that life is meaningless or nature is meaningless and everything is meaningless, I usually say, "Well, do you think that humans are meaning making creatures?" And they'll say, "Yeah, I think humans are meaning making creatures." I'd be like, "So you are giving meaning to the world around you?" And they'll say, "Yeah." I'd be like, "Okay, are you a part of nature?" And they'll be like, "Yeah, I'm a part of nature." So if you're a part of nature and you are giving life meaning, does that somehow is there a subcomponent of nature that might be meaningful? If
Well, I think life is all about meaning. Even for an ant, it has its things that it wants to do, and that which helps it realize that which it wants to do is meaningful to it.
mm,
Um, no, I think uh, meaning is about. So the best definition I ever heard of this was that,
Bateson,
yeah, information that makes a difference. So information is a difference, but meaning is a difference that makes a difference.
hmm
You know, if something makes a difference to you, then your life has meaning, right? Now, that could be a very low level meaning, like I'm hungry, and that hamburger makes a difference to my hunger. That's meaningful. But kind of a sort of shadow Maslowian view that there's a hierarchy of meanings, and there are higher meanings, right?
hmm hmm
And I think depending on the level of development of a person, they're going to be motivated more and more by the deeper meanings than the superficial ones.
mm,
Now, our species is on the brink, right? Like we have, at least since the 1940s, had the capacity to destroy not only our species with nuclear weapons, but um, probably a lot of life on Earth, if not all life on Earth.
mm,
How do we keep that from happening?
hmm hmm
How do we cultivate a a culture, a society, a societal structure, such that um, lives can be meaningful, and most people are not driven into desperation of monetary impoverishment, but also spiritual impoverishment, right?
hmm hmm
So what is a rich life? A rich life is one full of friendship, love, kindness, connection,
hmm
physical health, mental health, emotional health. An impoverished life is one of isolation, physical incapacity. You know, our society as it is now is one that is driving people into various forms of impoverishment
hmm
and maybe enriching a tiny, tiny minority. That has to be changed, right? Everything has to be rethought. Just because, Adam Smith thought of capitalism in 1776 doesn't mean we have to always have this form of capitalism.
hmm
And in fact, the kind of capitalism we have now is cronyism. It's not what Adam Smith envisioned, which was free market capitalism. So we have a lot of things before us as a species, right? So the thinking people of our species, like you and me and many others, um, need to really not just get by, but think things through. Like, how do we rethink the parameters of society such that the best is brought out in people,
yeah.
such that we don't blow ourselves up, such that we do not drive the ecosystem into collapse?
hmm hmm
But it's within our power to do so, right?
hmm
And it has happened before, like the slavery and women's voting examples.
hmm
We and I find a lot of meaning in that,
hmm
in trying to play a role in fostering change.
yeah.
So these books that I've written, that's just really ultimately the first step, right? Because if people don't feel that they have some say in the matter of what becomes of them, they're going to sit there like one of those learned helplessness dogs,
Right. Just be at the
and
whim
they'll
of
do nothing.
right at the whim of their desires and an existential void. acting out in ways that may not be of true benefit to the rest of the world or themselves even.
Absolutely. And, so the first step is to realize that, in fact, you are an agent and you have say in what shall become of you,
Mm,
and that you're not a learned helplessness dog, but you can jump out of the cage.
mm,
What is the cage? Well, there's many cages that we live in. Some of them are physical, like I could put you literally into a prison,
mm,
or actually I can control your mind, right? So and this is people in power have always imprisoned other people's minds
right.
so that they become effectively their slaves, right? So in the medieval Italy, um, you know, I imprisoned your mind, I imprisoned your imagination into a falsehood that, if you don't obey the aristocracy and the clergy, you'll burn in hell forever. And or you're going to get your pie in the sky, so you should be satisfied with your crappy life now. Well, eventually that became unbelievable, and people broke out of that prison.
Hmm.
But an important question to ask is, what prisons are we imprisoned in now,
Hmm.
and how do we set ourselves free from them?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, on that note, I would say our missions are aligned. I would also say that I thank you so much for your work, as I know you've changed lots of people, as well as my own opinion on free will, and made me feel less like a meat puppet,
Well,
which
that's
would
just the
like to
first
be.
step. Now we have to do something about the world.
Right, right. Well, we're all working on it in our own ways. I'm trying to bring back the hunter gatherer lifestyle to some extent, of course, within the parameters of modern life, and not to be too unrealistic. But
Great,
it
great,
involves lots of the things that you've mentioned, and of course, it's an integration of modern day neuropsychology and actually Eastern philosophy, Taoism in particular, and an examination of hunter gatherers that are existing today. But in any case, Peter,
beautiful, beautiful.
thank you so much for joining me and spending so much time. This
Yeah.
is definitely the longest episode, and I know you're a busy person and you have jet lag and all this stuff. But I hope you also found the conversation, fun. And
Well, it was really nice meeting you and chatting with you, and may we meet again.
okay, thank you so
All right.
much. Bye.
Bye.